Tonight we are going back to a time when five musicians found themselves caught between extraordinary success and the collapse of their private lives. They were Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, McVie, John McVie, and Mick Fleetwood. Together, they would create an album filled with separation, jealousy, longing, anger, tenderness, and memories that refused to fade. The album was called Rumours. Its songs sounded warm and inviting, the melodies were clear, the harmonies were carefully arranged, the rhythms seemed effortless. But beneath that polished surface were conversations between people who were no longer certain they wanted to remain in the same room. Lovers were singing to former lovers. A wife was writing about leaving her husband while he played bass behind her. A man was arranging and producing songs written about the end of his own relationship. The musicians did not repair their personal lives before making the record. Instead, they continued working while those lives were coming apart. A private conversation might end badly. Someone might leave the room. Feelings might remain unresolved. Then the tape would begin to roll. The same people who struggled to speak calmly to one another could still gather around microphones and find the exact notes surrounding one another's voices. That contradiction is at the heart of Rumours. It was not simply an album created during chaos. It was an album created by people who repeatedly transformed chaos into something controlled. The story began many years before Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham entered Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac had originally formed in Britain in 1967. In its earliest years, it was primarily a blues band, associated above all with guitarist Peter Green and the rhythm section of drummer Mick Fleetwood and bass player John McVie. The band had success, but it also experienced constant change. Peter Green left. Other singers and guitarists came and went. The sound gradually moved away from strict British blues and toward something more melodic. McVie, already an accomplished singer, songwriter, and keyboard player, officially joined the group in 1970. She was married to John McVie, and her presence gave the band another distinctive voice. By the early 1970s, Fleetwood Mac had survived more changes than many bands could have endured. There were disputes involving management. There were arguments over who had the right to use the Fleetwood Mac name. There were moves between Britain and the United States. There were successful records, disappointing records, departing musicians, and uncertain plans. By 1974, the remaining core included Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, McVie, and guitarist and songwriter Bob Welch. Fleetwood Mac was not an unknown band. It had an established name, an experienced rhythm section, a recording contract, and a long history. But it was unstable. Its identity was changing again, and it was about to lose another guitarist. At the same time, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham were struggling to build a life together in California. They had first met around 1966 when they were teenagers in the San Francisco Bay Area. Stevie later remembered Lindsey singing the Mamas and the Papas song California Dreamin' at some kind of youth or school gathering. She joined in with the harmony. The exact setting has changed slightly in different retellings. Sometimes it has been described as a party, sometimes as a school event, sometimes as a gathering connected with a youth organization. But the essential memory remained the same. Lindsey was singing, Stevie added her voice, and something in the combination stayed with them. About 2 years later, Stevie joined a band called Fritz. Lindsey was already a member, playing bass. Fritz became a busy working band around the San Francisco area. The group performed its own shows and opened for more established performers. For Stevie and Lindsey, the band became both an education and a test. They learned about stages, audiences, rehearsals, personalities, and competition. They also began learning how differently they approached music. Stevie was drawn to words, atmosphere, memory, and imagery. Her songs could feel as though they came from dreams, old stories, distant rooms, or half-remembered conversations. Lindsey was fascinated by structure. He listened closely to guitar parts, arrangements, rhythms, transitions, and the way separate sounds could be fitted together. She often began with an emotional landscape. He often began asking how the landscape could be constructed. After Fritz ended, Stevie and Lindsey continued as a duo. Their musical partnership gradually became a romantic one as well. The exact moment when friendship turned into romance is difficult to place, even in their own later memories. But by the early 1970s, their work, relationship, finances, and ambitions had become deeply connected. They moved toward Los Angeles and began developing original material. They worked with producer Keith Olsen at Sound City Studios. Sound City did not look especially glamorous. From the outside, it resembled an ordinary industrial building. Inside, however, was a recording room that musicians and producers came to value for its distinctive sound. Stevie and Lindsey recorded an album there under the name Buckingham Nicks. The album displayed much of what would later become familiar. There were layered harmonies, there were careful guitar arrangements, there was Lindsey's increasing interest in shaping every detail. There was Stevie's emerging identity as a songwriter whose words seemed both personal and mysterious. The album was released by Polydor Records in 1973. It did not become a hit. Buckingham Nicks would eventually develop a devoted following, especially after Stevie and Lindsey became famous. But that later reputation can make it easy to forget what the album meant at the time. It was a commercial disappointment. The record company did not continue supporting the duo. The album became difficult to find. Stevie and Lindsey had made the record they hoped would begin their career and then watched it disappear. The following period was difficult. They continued writing, they recorded demonstrations of new songs, they tried to attract interest, but music was not providing a reliable living. Stevie worked outside jobs to help support them. She waited tables, she cleaned houses, she took whatever work could keep them moving, while Lindsey concentrated heavily on music. Later descriptions sometimes make these years sound romantic. There is a familiar image of two unknown artists suffering for their work before finally being discovered. But living through those years was not a charming story with a guaranteed ending. There was no assurance that success was waiting. There was only the next bill, the next song, the next demonstration tape, and another attempt to convince someone to listen. Their relationship carried the weight of all of it. They were lovers, musical partners, creative rivals, and financial partners. An argument about a song could become an argument about the relationship. An argument about money could become an argument about music. Their professional identities were so closely joined that it became difficult to know where one part of the partnership ended and another began. Lindsey became increasingly exacting about arrangements and production. He could spend long periods searching for the right guitar sound or vocal texture. Stevie continued writing songs that she believed deserved an audience. Among the songs taking shape during these years were pieces that would later become important to Fleetwood Mac. But at the time, the future of Buckingham Nicks was uncertain. They were close to the point where many talented musicians quietly disappear. Then, late in 1974, Mick Fleetwood entered Sound City Studios. He was not searching for Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. He was considering studios where Fleetwood Mac might record. Keith Olsen wanted to demonstrate the sound of the room. To do that, he played a track from the Buckingham Nicks album called Frozen Love. Frozen Love was long, ambitious, and carefully arranged. As Mick listened, he became interested in the guitar playing. He asked who the guitarist was. The guitarist was Lindsey Buckingham. This was not a planned audition. Stevie and Lindsey had not arranged for Mick to hear the song. Keith Olsen was showing off the studio, not formally presenting two new members for Fleetwood Mac. But a recording made by two struggling musicians happened to be playing when the drummer of an established band walked into the room. Mick met Lindsey. Nothing immediate came of the encounter because Bob Welch was still a member of Fleetwood Mac, but Mick remembered the guitar playing. Near the end of 1974, Bob Welch decided to leave the band. Once again, Fleetwood Mac needed a guitarist. Mick thought about the musician he had heard on Frozen Love. He approached Lindsey about joining. For Lindsey, the offer created a difficult choice. Fleetwood Mac had a recording contract, a recognized name, and an experienced rhythm section. It offered the kind of professional opportunity he and Stevie had been trying to reach for years. But the invitation was initially for Lindsey. He made it clear that he and Stevie were a package. He would not join without her. This was more than a boyfriend insisting that his girlfriend be included. Buckingham Nicks had been a working musical unit. Their songs, harmonies, finances, and ambitions were intertwined. Lindsey could not simply step into an established band and leave the partnership behind as though it had been a casual side project. Fleetwood Mac would have to take both of them. Christine McVie also needed to be comfortable with the arrangement. The band was not merely adding a guitarist, it was adding another female singer and songwriter to a group in which Christine already occupied that position. Later accounts describe a social meeting between Christine and Stevie. Some versions include detailed memories involving drinks, clothing, restaurants, or the timing of Stevie's work shift. Those details come from recollections formed long after the event. The important point is simpler. Christine and Stevie met. They liked one another. Christine did not see Stevie as someone who would make the group impossible. The arrangement moved forward quickly. By the beginning of 1975, Fleetwood Mac had a new five-person lineup. Mick Fleetwood played drums, John McVie played bass. Christine McVie sang, wrote songs, and played keyboards. Lindsey Buckingham sang, wrote songs, played guitar, and increasingly shaped arrangements. Stevie Nicks sang and brought a collection of songs unlike anything Fleetwood Mac had previously recorded. The first rehearsals revealed that the combination could work. Lindsey did not behave like a guitarist hired merely to decorate completed songs. He listened for places where a structure could be changed. He later remembered working on Christine's song Over My Head and altering part of its bridge. For Lindsey, this was an early sign that he could contribute to Christine's music without taking away what made it hers. Christine brought a strong musical foundation. Her songs were concise, melodic, and emotionally direct. Lindsey could hear ways of adjusting their movement, rhythm, and texture. Stevie's songs presented a different challenge. They often began with simple chord patterns and a strong emotional atmosphere. This gave the band room to invent the world surrounding them. John and Mick became the foundation beneath all three writers. John's bass playing was economical but melodic. He rarely filled every available space. His notes could subtly redirect the emotion of a song. Mick's drumming was built around feel. He did not always play like a machine, keeping perfectly rigid time. He placed beats where they created movement, tension, or release. Together, John and Mick could make songs written by three very different people sound as though they belonged to one band. The new lineup entered the studio with Keith Olsen to record an album simply called Fleetwood Mac. The album was released in July of 1975. Christine contributed songs including Over My Head and Say You Love Me. They were warm, open, and melodic. Her voice offered reassurance even when the emotions underneath were uncertain. Lindsey brought songs, guitar parts, arrangements, and a growing determination to make every section count. Stevie brought Landslide and Rhiannon. Landslide was quiet and reflective. Stevie had written it during the difficult Buckingham Nicks years when she was wondering whether she should continue pursuing music or choose a more stable life. It was a song about change, fear, time, and the possibility that a person might not remain who she had once been. Rhiannon was something else. The song had begun after Stevie encountered the name in a novel. She later learned about the name's connection to Welsh mythology, but the original song grew from her own imagination. Its chords were relatively simple, its atmosphere was not. The band created a dark, circling arrangement around Stevie's voice. On stage, the song became more dramatic. Stevie's performance helped establish the visual identity that would follow her throughout her career. Flowing clothing, dark colors, movement, and a sense that the song belonged partly to another world. It would have been easy to mistake this image for a lack of discipline, but Stevie was highly ambitious. She had spent years protecting her songs when very few people were interested in hearing them. She understood the value of presentation. She also understood that Fleetwood Mac had given her an opportunity that might never come again. The Fleetwood Mac album did not become an immediate sensation on the day it appeared. Its success developed gradually. The band toured constantly. One single led listeners toward another. Over My Head gained attention. Rhiannon became a major radio song. Say You Love Me expanded the audience further. The album climbed slowly until it eventually reached number one in the United States. For Stevie and Lindsey, the change was enormous. Not long before, they had been wondering how they would continue paying their bills. Now they were part of one of the most successful bands in America. But success did not solve the problems within their relationship. It intensified them. For years, Stevie and Lindsey had lived in a small, enclosed world. They had depended on one another emotionally, professionally, and financially. Now that world suddenly expanded. There were long tours, there were interviews, there were new friends and new temptations. There was constant attention. There was also a change in balance. Stevie was no longer merely Lindsey's musical partner. She was becoming a star in her own right. Audiences responded immediately to her voice, her songs, and her presence. Lindsey was receiving recognition too, but his most important work was not always obvious to an audience. Many of his greatest contributions happened inside arrangements, guitar layers, vocal harmonies, and decisions made in the studio. Stevie stood at the front of the stage singing Rhiannon. Lindsey might spend days finding the guitar part that helped make the song unforgettable. Both contributions mattered, but they were rewarded differently. Old tensions grew. The romance had already been under strain before they joined Fleetwood Mac. By 1976, it was breaking apart. It is difficult to identify one exact moment when the relationship ended. There were periods of separation, emotional retreat, renewed closeness, arguments, and attempts to continue. The ending was a process rather than a single clean event. The marriage of Christine and John McVie was also failing. They had been together before Christine officially joined Fleetwood Mac. Years of touring, drinking, work, and life inside the band had worn down the relationship. They separated and eventually divorced, but they did not stop working together. John remained the bass player on Christine's songs. Some of those songs were about leaving the marriage, others were inspired by a new relationship. John had to hear them, learn them, refine them, and play exactly what the music required. Mick Fleetwood's home life was unstable as well. His marriage to Jenny Boyd had already suffered from infidelity and earlier upheaval connected with another Fleetwood Mac guitarist. The problems in Mick's marriage did not begin at exactly the same time as the other two breakups. The familiar description that everyone in Fleetwood Mac was separating at once is emotionally close to the truth but not chronologically precise. The three relationships had different histories, they reached different stages at different times, but by the period when the band began making Rumours, the private lives of all five musicians had become unsettled. The success of the 1975 album created another problem. Fleetwood Mac now had to make a follow-up. The new lineup had already proven itself. The next album could no longer be treated as a pleasant surprise from a recently reorganized band. Expectations were high. The record company wanted another success. Audiences were waiting. The musicians understood that the opportunity could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. In early 1976, Fleetwood Mac began the principal recording sessions for Rumours at the record plant in Sausalito, California. The studio was located north of San Francisco. Mick wanted the band away from its usual surroundings and domestic distractions. The record plant offered isolation. It also created an enclosed world in which work, relationships, exhaustion, and recreation became difficult to separate. The sessions often continued late into the night. Days could begin in the afternoon. Time was measured by meals, substances, arguments, tape reels, and whether anyone had captured a useful performance. Stevie and Christine stayed nearby. The men spent much of their time in lodging associated with the studio. The atmosphere has often been described as wild. Cocaine and alcohol were readily available. The musicians later acknowledged using both heavily. Christine remembered champagne and cocaine being part of the period. Stevie later described the group's drug use more severely and spoke openly about the danger her own cocaine use eventually created. The substances extended nights and weakened judgment. They could intensify emotional reactions. They also became part of the mythology surrounding the album. But cocaine did not create Rumours. It did not arrange the harmonies. It did not tune the guitars. It did not repair damaged tapes. It did not decide which drum pattern would make a song feel suspended in midair. The album required long attention, memory, patience, technical knowledge, and repeated acts of self-control. The drugs were one pressure within a larger system. There was also exhaustion. There was ambition. There was fame. There were broken relationships. There was the fear that the band's success might vanish, and there was a growing perfectionism that caused songs to be rebuilt again and again. The production team included the band Ken Caullet and Richard Dashuhei. Richard Dashuhei had previously worked with Lindsey and understood many of his musical instincts. Ken Caullet brought engineering experience and gradually took on a larger production role. A producer in this setting was not simply someone who pressed a record button. The producers helped organize sessions, evaluate performances, settle technical questions, manage conflicting personalities, and keep the work moving toward a finished album. The recording process was analog. Every performance was captured on physical tape. There was no computer screen displaying an unlimited number of perfectly movable pieces. Tape had to be recorded, played, rewound, marked, cut, copied, and joined. An edit might involve physically cutting the tape with a razor blade. An overdub meant adding another recorded layer while carefully preserving what was already there. The slower process could be frustrating, but Ken Calais later believed that the waiting also created opportunities. While equipment was being adjusted or tape was being prepared, the people in the room had time to think. A conversation might lead to a different arrangement. A technical delay might prevent the band from rushing past a problem. The songs grew gradually. Many began with basic performances from the rhythm section. Then parts were replaced, guitars were layered, vocals were added, harmonies were reconsidered, sections were shortened, lengthened, or moved. Small pieces from separate performances were sometimes combined. The finished album sounded unified, but it was not simply a recording of 5 musicians playing each song once in a room. It was a studio construction designed to preserve the emotional feeling of a live band. The musicians might have struggled with ordinary conversation, but they still communicated constantly through music. They had to discuss tempo, they had to agree on keys, they had to decide where a harmony should enter, they had to listen to playback. They had to determine whether a bass note was helping or crowding a vocal. They had to compare different guitar sounds. They had to decide whether a performance felt honest. The idea that the members never spoke to one another is an exaggeration. Personal communication could be cold, divided, or hostile. Musical communication remained detailed. Sometimes the work itself was the only safe subject available. One of the clearest examples of this strange professional intimacy involves Stevie and Lindsey singing harmony. Ken Calais later remembered occasions when the two had been arguing shortly before recording. Then the tape began. They moved toward the microphones. Their voices blended with the familiarity developed over many years. They knew where the other person would breathe. They knew how the other voice formed a vowel. They knew which notes would create tension and which would soften it. The relationship could be collapsing outside the song. Inside the harmony, the history still functioned. That history is especially important in dreams. Stevie wrote Dreams during the record plant sessions. She left the main recording area and went into a separate room, sometimes called the pit. The room was associated with musician Sly Stone and contained a keyboard and a simple rhythm machine. Stevie began playing a small pattern. The song came quickly. Later retellings sometimes say that she completed it in about 10 minutes. The safer description is that it arrived in a rapid burst. Dreams was not built around a complicated chord progression. Its power came from repetition, space, and confidence. Stevie brought the song back to the band. At first, its simplicity may have made it difficult for everyone to understand what it could become. Lindsey helped shape the arrangement. Mick created a steady drum feel. John found a bass part that moved beneath the surface without disturbing the song's calm. Christine added keyboard textures. Lindsey created guitar sounds that appeared and disappeared like reflections. Ken Calais later recalled that a carefully selected section of mixed drumming was repeated to provide the song's hypnotic foundation. The result seemed almost weightless. Dreams addressed Lindsey after the breakup, but it did not answer anger with equal anger. Stevie's narrator sounded distant and knowing. She warned that freedom would have consequences. The person leaving might discover that loneliness had its own sound. Rain would fall. Memory would return. The song did not beg Lindsey to remain. It suggested that one day he would understand what had been lost. Stevie later described Dreams as a response to Go Your Own Way. The two songs approached the same separation from different directions. Dreams floated. Go Your Own Way drove forward. Dreams predicted regret. Go Your Own Way announced departure. Dreams concealed its wound beneath calm language. Go Your Own Way allowed the wound to become rhythm. Lindsey built Go Your Own Way around a forceful acoustic guitar pattern. The guitar seemed to push the song forward even when the emotions remained stuck. Mixed drumming added uncertainty. Ken Calais remembered that the drum feel was influenced in part by the Rolling Stones song Street Fighting Man. The pattern did not land exactly where an unprepared listener might expect. That instability became part of the song's character. It sounded determined, but not settled. The guitar solo was assembled from multiple recorded attempts. Lindsey searched for phrases that could carry the emotion without reducing it to noise. The finished solo seemed to burst through the carefully controlled surface. Go Your Own Way was Lindsey's declaration that the relationship was over, but the performance did not sound emotionally free. Anger and attachment remained tangled together. Stevie was particularly hurt by the line accusing her of wanting to spend her time packing up and shacking up. She believed it misrepresented her behavior. For her, it was not merely a songwriter expressing pain, it was a public accusation placed inside a song that she would have to help record. Lindsey later defended the line as an expression of his emotional viewpoint. It was not intended as a neutral historical report. It represented how the breakup felt to him. The disagreement never disappeared. Stevie still sang harmony on the recording. She later stood on stage and performed the song night after night, often only a few feet away from Lindsey. The line she hated became one of the most famous lines on one of the most famous albums ever made. There was no private resolution. There was a musical arrangement. That difference mattered. Lindsey's song Never Going Back Again presented another side of the breakup. He wrote it after a brief new relationship gave him a sense that he might be emerging from despair. The title sounded final. The guitar part was delicate, intricate, and demanding. Lindsey played an acoustic guitar using a carefully controlled finger-picking pattern. The brightness of the strings mattered so much that, according to Ken Callane's recollection, fresh strings were installed repeatedly during recording. As the strings were played, their sound gradually changed. Lindsey wanted the tone to remain consistent. Then the recording encountered a more serious problem. After extensive work, it was discovered that later parts had been recorded in a mismatched key. Much of the guitar performance had to be recreated. It was the kind of technical disaster that could drain the life from a song. Instead, Lindsey played it again. The finished recording sounded light and natural. The labor disappeared into the music. The title, Never Going Back Again, suggested certainty. But the rest of Rumours revealed that Lindsey was still returning emotionally to the relationship. He could announce departure. He could insist that he would not look back. Then he could spend months producing songs that preserved the relationship in extraordinary detail. Christine McVie wrote from a different emotional position. Her songs often used plain language. They did not need symbolic storms or open confrontation to carry feeling. Don't Stop, Look Toward the Future. The song was connected to her separation from John McVie and her determination not to remain trapped in yesterday's pain. Its message was simple. Tomorrow might be better than the past. The simplicity could sound cheerful, but it was not naive. Christine had lived through the deterioration of her marriage. She was not promising that the future would improve by magic. She was choosing to move toward it. During recording, Don't Stop became a duet between Christine and Lindsey. Their voices gave the song a conversational quality. Christine's warmth met Lindsey's sharper tone. The optimism became active rather than passive. John later recalled that he did not immediately realize the song was directed toward the end of their marriage. Because this memory came much later, it is impossible to know exactly what he understood at every moment in 1976. He may have avoided asking. He may have understood gradually. He may have separated the song from his personal life because that was the only way to work. Whatever he knew, John played bass on it. His job was not to approve the message. His job was to help the song move. Christine's You Make Loving Fun was inspired by a new relationship with the band's lighting director, Curry Grant. The song carried the excitement of discovering affection after a marriage had become painful. Its title was open and joyful. Its arrangement felt buoyant. Christine played an electric keyboard called a clavinet. The instrument was processed through a wah-wah pedal, creating a rhythmic sound that helped define the track. Ken Callahan remembered Mick helping manipulate the pedal while Christine played. Even a song about Christine's new love required cooperation from members of the old musical family. A frequently repeated story claims that Christine told John the song was about her dog. The story may be true. It appears in later biographies and recollections, but it is not strongly supported by documentation from the time. The well-established fact is that the song was connected to Curry Grant. Whether John received an alternative explanation is less certain. Once again, the quieter truth may be more revealing than the colorful story. John played on a joyful song written by his wife about another man. He did not need a dramatic confrontation for the situation to be painful. The bass line itself was evidence that he remained in the room. Christine's most tender contribution to Rumours was Songbird. She later remembered being unable to sleep when the song arrived. She sat at a piano and found that the music and words seemed almost complete. She wrote it quickly, perhaps in about half an hour. Unlike some of the album's other songs, Songbird was not aimed at one specific person. Christine described it as being for everybody. It had the quality of a private prayer. The song needed a setting different from the dense studio construction surrounding much of the album. Ken Cauley arranged for Christine to record it at Zell Urbach Auditorium in Berkeley. The auditorium was large and quiet. Microphones were placed around the space to capture its natural sound. Christine sat alone at a grand piano. The size of the room created a gentle distance around her voice. Participant memories describe flowers placed nearby and an atmosphere designed to make the empty hall feel warmer. Those details may have become polished through years of retelling. The essential facts remain. Christine performed the song largely alone. The natural space of the auditorium became part of the recording. On an album built through layers, edits, conflict, and reconstruction, Songbird created the feeling of one person speaking softly in a large room. The tenderness of the performance did not mean Christine's life was calm. She was ending a marriage. She was beginning another relationship. She was drinking and using cocaine. She was working beside her former husband. Her apparent steadiness was relative. She may have seemed calmer than the people around her, but she was moving through the same emotional weather. The album's most collective song was The Chain. It was the only track credited to all 5 members. The Chain was not written from beginning to end during one ordinary songwriting session. It was assembled from pieces. Some material came from an earlier Christine song called Keep Me There. Other elements came from Stevie's words and melodies. Lindsey helped construct the form. John created the famous bass figure that begins the final section. Mick's drums built tension around it. Lindsey's guitar entered and drove the music toward its climax. Different participants have remembered the exact order of construction differently. That is not unusual. The song developed over months. Pieces were tried, abandoned, recovered, and altered. Legal credit eventually went to all 5, but no official credit sheet can perfectly reconstruct every suggestion made in every room. The broad story is clear. The Chain was made by preserving useful fragments. A section that had not found a home was not necessarily worthless. An abandoned idea could return in a new form. A bass line could suddenly reveal what the entire song had been missing. The meaning of the song also matched the condition of the band. The words described a connection surviving betrayal and disappointment. The members had damaged their private relationships. They no longer trusted one another in the same ways, but the musical bond remained. Breaking it would have meant giving up something none of them could easily recreate elsewhere. The Chain protected them. It also held them in place. John's bass entrance became one of the most recognizable moments on the album. It began alone, low and controlled. Mick's drums slowly gathered around it. The sound created anticipation before the final guitar release. That famous passage came from the member who spoke least publicly about his feelings. John did not write a detailed lyrical account of his divorce. He expressed himself through placement, tone, and restraint. The Chain gave him the album's most dramatic instrumental entrance. As the months passed, the physical recording tapes began to suffer. The masters had been played again and again. Each playback created a small amount of wear. High-frequency detail began to deteriorate. The problem became serious enough that technical help was required. Less used safety copies still contained clearer information, but they did not run at exactly the same speed as the worn masters. A specialist helped synchronize the different tapes through careful speed adjustment. The goal was to preserve the performances while recovering lost clarity. Simplified versions of this story sometimes claim that Rumours was almost erased. That description goes too far. The music had not vanished, but the sound quality of the master tapes was genuinely endangered by the enormous amount of work performed on them. The pursuit of perfection had begun damaging the object that contained the music. It was an appropriate technical crisis for this particular album. Like the relationships, the recordings had been used, revisited, strained, and pushed close to failure. The solution was not to return them to an untouched state. That was impossible. The engineers had to combine what remained. One of the most painful decisions involved Stevie's song Silver Springs. Stevie wrote the song about Lindsey. Its title came from seeing the name Silver Spring, Maryland on a road sign. She liked the sound of the words. They suggested a place that could be both real and imagined. The song described a relationship that would continue through memory even after physical separation. The narrator warned that her voice would follow the person who had left. Time would not erase her. The connection might become invisible, but it would remain. Silver Springs was recorded for Rumours. Stevie believed it was one of her most important songs. But an album made for vinyl had physical limits. Each side could hold only so much music before sound quality suffered. Silver Springs was long and developed gradually. The album already contained other slower material. The producers and band also considered pacing. They needed to decide how one song would lead into the next and how the two sides of the record would balance. Silver Springs was removed. The shorter and more energetic I Don't Want to Know was added instead. The decision was not simply that Silver Springs was considered an inferior song. Running time mattered. Sequencing mattered. The overall balance of the album mattered. But those practical explanations did not reduce Stevie's hurt. She had written a song she considered central to her experience. Now it would not appear on the album. Later, Stevie remembered Mick telling her the news outside the studio in a parking area. That setting comes mainly from her recollection. The exact surroundings cannot be independently reconstructed. The emotional result is not in doubt. She was deeply upset. Silver Springs was released as the B-side of Go Your Own Way. That pairing carried its own strange meaning. Lindsey's public declaration of separation appeared on one side. Stevie's warning that he would never completely escape her appeared on the other. For years, Silver Springs remained less familiar than the songs included on Rumours. Eventually, it returned to the center of the Fleetwood Mac story. When the band reunited for the concert project The Dance in the 1990s, Stevie performed Silver Springs while looking directly toward Lindsey. The song that had been removed from Rumours became one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the band's later history. It had waited. Just as its lyrics promised, it had not disappeared. Stevie's Gold Dust Woman closed the original album. The song gathered several of the darker pressures surrounding her. Fame had arrived. So had exhaustion, competition, drugs, damaged relationships, and the fear of being consumed by success. Stevie later connected the image of gold dust to both glamour and danger. Gold suggested wealth, beauty, and attention. Dust suggested something that could scatter, disappear, or settle over everything. The arrangement became increasingly ominous. Unusual percussion sounds were explored. Ken Calais remembered experiments involving breaking glass. Stevie pushed her voice into a rawer sound. The performance seemed to move away from the controlled calm of dreams and toward something more dangerous. Gold Dust Woman should not be reduced to a secret code describing one drug or one person. Stevie's explanations changed in emphasis over time. That does not necessarily mean the song had no meaning. It means the song held several meanings at once. It drew from addiction, ambition, relationships, rivalry, exhaustion, and the fear that success might destroy the person receiving it. The three principal writers on Rumours turned emotion into songs in different ways. Lindsey often wrote through confrontation. His rhythms carried nervous energy. Even when his words announced certainty, his performances revealed unresolved attachment. Stevie transformed experience into symbolic landscapes. Weather, dreams, darkness, gold, voices, and distant places carried emotions that ordinary explanation could not contain. Christine often wrote with direct warmth. She looked toward tomorrow. She welcomed new affection. She offered comfort without pretending that pain had never happened. The differences gave the album its range. Rumours did not sound like one person describing one breakup. It sounded like several people standing in different corners of the same emotional room. Recording continued across several studios. The principal Soso Leto sessions were only part of the process. Touring interrupted the work. Overdubs and mixing extended the schedule. This is why different accounts describe the album as taking a year, 18 months, or some other length of time. The answer depends on what is being counted. There was initial recording, there were interruptions, there were additional studios, there were vocal sessions, instrumental overdubs, mixing, sequencing, and tape repair. The 1975 Fleetwood Mac album had been completed much more quickly. Rumours grew through repetition. The band continued changing arrangements long after simpler versions might have been considered acceptable. The emotional difficulty did not prevent concentration. In some ways, concentration may have offered relief. A guitar sound could be solved, a harmony could be corrected, a tape edit could be measured. Those problems had answers. The relationships did not. Inside the studio, uncertainty could temporarily be converted into a technical decision. Should the vocal be louder? Should the bass enter earlier? Should the song repeat another chorus? Should the guitar be recorded again? Should one song be removed to make room for another? These questions could be argued, tested, and answered. No similar process could determine whether Stevie and Lindsey should have remained together. There was no control room button that could restore Christine and John's marriage. There was no perfectly edited version of Mick's family life. The musicians could not repair everything. They could finish an album. Rumours was released on February 4th, 1977. It quickly grew from a successful record into a cultural phenomenon. The album produced 4 top 10 singles in the United States. Dreams reached number 1. Go Your Own Way, Don't Stop, and You Make Loving Fun became major hits. Rumours spent 31 non-consecutive weeks at number 1 on the American album chart. It eventually sold tens of millions of copies around the world. In February of 1978, it received the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. The 5 musicians who had struggled to preserve ordinary relationships now possessed one of the most successful albums ever recorded. Success did not provide closure. The band had to tour. Every night they performed the songs in front of large audiences. Stevie sang Dreams while Lindsey played guitar. Lindsey sang Go Your Own Way while Stevie added harmony. Christine sang songs about leaving John while John stood nearby playing bass. The private arguments had become public rituals. Thousands of listeners sang along. Audiences began watching the musicians for evidence. A glance across the stage could appear meaningful. A change in expression could become part of the story. The band's emotional history was no longer entirely its own. Listeners adopted the songs and connected them to their own lives. Someone going through a breakup could hear Dreams as a warning. Another person could hear Go Your Own Way as permission to leave. Don't Stop could become a promise that tomorrow would be different. Songbird could become a wedding song, a farewell, or a quiet message to someone who might never hear it. The specific relationships that created the album gradually expanded into something larger. The songs no longer belonged only to the people who wrote them. During the touring period, another relationship complicated the group. Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood became romantically involved. Later summaries sometimes placed their affair inside the original recording sessions. The better supported chronology places it primarily during the tour after Rumours had been released. Mick was still connected to his marriage. Stevie had been Lindsey's partner. The new relationship added another link to an already delicate chain. It did not last, but in Fleetwood Mac, relationships rarely ended without remaining present in some form. The people involved still had rehearsals, flights, interviews, concerts, and business decisions waiting for them. Fame enlarged every problem. There was more money, there was less privacy, there was greater access to drugs, there were more people surrounding the band. There was also more pressure to remain together. Leaving an unsuccessful group can be difficult. Leaving one of the biggest bands in the world carries a different weight. Each member had become part of a combination that could not easily be reproduced. Mick was more than the drummer. He was a founder, organizer, recruiter, and the person most invested in preserving the identity of Fleetwood Mac. John's bass playing was tied closely to Mick's drumming. Christine brought melodic clarity and emotional warmth. Stevie brought a unique voice, songs, and an immediately recognizable presence. Lindsey brought guitar playing, arrangements, studio experimentation, and a relentless desire to reshape the music. None of them was easily replaceable within that particular chemistry. The same bond that preserved their success also required former couples to remain in one another's lives. Lindsey later described the songs on Rumours as autobiographical cross-conversations. The musicians were writing about one another, they were also helping one another deliver the messages. Stevie did not merely hear Go Your Own Way after it was finished, her voice became part of it. Lindsey did not simply tolerate Dreams, he helped arrange and produce it. John did not merely learn that Christine had written about moving forward, his bass became part of the forward movement. Their professionalism did not erase resentment, it transformed resentment into performance. That transformation required something more complicated than friendship. It required listening. The five musicians did not always trust one another personally, but they continued trusting certain musical instincts. Stevie could bring in a simple song and allow Lindsey to build around it, even while their relationship was ending. Lindsey could arrange a song that portrayed him as the person who would eventually regret leaving. John could find the right notes beneath Christine's new happiness. Mick could create a drum part that held everyone together while his own life remained unstable. Christine could offer songs of warmth inside a band surrounded by conflict. This is why Rumours should not be understood as an accidental document of people behaving badly. The conflict provided emotional material, it did not provide the craft. The album endured because raw experience was repeatedly shaped, melodies were revised, tempos were tested, guitars were recorded again, vocals were layered, tapes were repaired, songs were removed, running orders were reconsidered. The people involved kept returning to the work. Rumours sounded controlled not because the musicians felt controlled, but because they created control inside the music. The clear surface contained the emotional disorder beneath it. When the time came to make another album, Lindsey resisted the idea of simply repeating the formula. The commercial expectation was obvious. Fleetwood Mac could have tried to make Rumours again. Lindsey pushed instead toward experimentation. The result was a double album Tusk. Tusk was stranger, less uniform, and more expensive to create. It reflected Lindsey's fear that the band might become trapped by its greatest success. Rumours had captured one particular moment. Trying to manufacture that same moment again would have turned emotional truth into a commercial exercise. The band moved forward, but Rumours remained behind them like a permanent landscape. The songs continued to follow the people who made them. The relationships changed again and again. Members left and returned. Stevie and Lindsey continued experiencing periods of affection, anger, distance, and renewed musical connection. Christine and John remained bandmates long after their marriage ended. Mick continued trying to preserve Fleetwood Mac through changing eras and lineups. The story never arrived at a perfectly peaceful conclusion. Perhaps that is one reason the album continues to feel alive. Rumours does not describe the calm acceptance that comes after every feeling has been resolved. It describes people still inside the experience. They are leaving, but still looking back. They are angry, but still listening. They are wounded, but still capable of harmony. The album's most famous collective song insists that the chain will keep them together. That chain can sound comforting. It can also sound heavy. A chain is a bond. The chain is also something that limits movement. For Fleetwood Mac, it was both. The five musicians survived because they found a way to keep working after intimacy had failed. They could not return to the relationships they had once known. They could preserve something else. They preserved the sound created when Mick Fleetwood's drums met John McVie's bass. They preserved Christine McVie's warmth. They preserved Stevie Nicks's mysterious emotional landscapes. They preserved Lindsey Buckingham's restless arrangements. They preserved voices that knew how to surround one another, even when the people behind those voices no longer knew how to live together. Outside the music, communication could become strained or nearly disappear. Inside the songs, they remained intensely connected. That is the quiet miracle of Rumours. The album was born from endings, yet making it required continuation. Again and again, the musicians returned to the studio. They returned to the microphones. They returned to the person across the room. They listened. They adjusted. They tried another take. And from relationships that could not be repaired, they constructed music that has lasted for generations. The arguments faded. The studio lights were switched off. The worn reels of tape were stored away. The tour moved from one city to another and eventually ended, but the voices remained. Stevie answering Lindsey. Lindsey answering Stevie. Christine looking toward tomorrow. John holding the song together beneath her. Mick placing the next beat exactly where it needed to fall. Five people, connected by affection, resentment, memory, ambition, and sound, still held together by the chain. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through rock history, please subscribe to Rock Me to Sleep for more calm stories about the artists, albums, and moments that shaped the music we remember. You can also leave a comment with the band or musician you would like to hear about next. Until then, rest easy and let the music fade into the night.